Hello, my name is Nicole Chalet. I'm the president of the Alexander Hamilton Awareness Society, also known as the AHA Society. We're so pleased and thankful that you're joining us here for this wonderful talk in celebration of Women's History Month. We're focusing on Eliza Schuyler Hamilton. And so I want to say on behalf of the board, we thank you for joining us. With that, we'll turn it over to our vice chair, Tom Aller, to officially introduce tonight's speaker. Tom?
Hey, thanks, Nicole, and good evening, everyone, and welcome. It's great to see you. So it's my pleasure to introduce Adam Levinson, tonight's speaker. Adam is a practicing lawyer, and in addition to his legal work, Adam is also the founder of Statutes and Stories, Collections and Reflections on American Legal History. And you can find this at statutesandstories.com. It started out as a legal history blog, but now has expanded its range to encompass many related aspects of U.S. history. Adam constantly adds fascinating new material to this blog, always basing his original research on primary sources. He has collaborated with the AHA Society on multiple presentations and exhibits. Adam has worked tirelessly to research the history of the early republic and to share his findings with the American people, and his enthusiasm for the topic is contagious. Much of Adam's recent work is focused on expanding our knowledge about the 1787 Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, and tonight's talk touches on that project. So, Adam, welcome. We're looking forward to hearing what you have for us.
Thank you, everybody. I appreciate the opportunity, and we absolutely welcome questions from everybody in the chat. And I know the collective wisdom of some of the names I'm seeing is tremendous, so I look forward to questions. So for Women's History Month, we're going to be talking about the Constitutional Convention. And if everybody looks at the left part of your screen, you're going to see it's 54 men, as we know, who were in Independence Hall at the Constitutional Convention. And you'll see Eliza in the middle of your screen. So the question for everyone is, what was Eliza doing in 1787 during the convention? And what were the other wives doing? And for years, historians either didn't have sources or weren't asking some of these questions. And now we have answers. So I'm going to be calling this the Eliza Philadelphia Surprise. And I want everyone to respond to if you agree or not. So when you look at some of the Hamilton biographies, when you look at some of the stories of the convention, there are wonderful sources. But again, what were the wives doing? And let's now try to tell Eliza's story. So the reason I call it the Eliza Philadelphia Surprise is when I found these 4 documents that we're going to be talking about today, I was surprised. I suspect that most historians are also surprised when they see this presentation. And it's very possible that Alexander was surprised when Eliza came to Philadelphia. And this raises the question, now that we have definitive proof that Eliza was in Philadelphia, and we'll explain why I think it's definitive proof, what else is unknown or unrecognized? So what other spotlights can we shine on this larger story of what was going on behind the scenes at the Constitutional Convention? And of course, the picture, the portrait on your left is Eliza, and the picture on your right, obviously, is Alexander, and that's the $10 bill picture. But we're going to come back towards the end of the presentation to go into what else was going on after the convention, because Eliza had a very busy year, and we're going to flesh out women's history with Eliza as our focus. So this is the first of 4 letters that I want to discuss today, and this letter is in the Alexander Hamilton papers. This is a letter that is no surprise. It's described by a professor, and we talk about some of the professors that are involved. But this is the first letter. It's a single page, and I'm going to tell you that there's wonderful information in this letter. This is our starting point. So what are the questions we're going to be asking? And I'm going to give you the answers in advance, so we're totally transparent. So when was the letter sent? And it's my thesis that the letter was sent in late May, mid to late May to early June. I have to hit the right button. Okay, so where was it written? And if Alexander was in Philadelphia, then obviously it would make sense that it was written from Philadelphia. And my argument is that this letter was an invitation, and you'll see why, for Eliza to come to Philadelphia to attend the Constitutional Convention. Now, she can't go in the building, but she can be there. And there were probably 7 to 9 other wives who were in Philadelphia, or I should say 7 to 8 other wives who were in Philadelphia, separate from the wives who were married to the Pennsylvania delegates. So approximately as many as 20% of the delegates did have spouses who at one time or another were in Philadelphia. Philadelphia. And some of you may know Philadelphia was the largest American city. It was a place to be, New York also, but we're going to talk about Philadelphia. So another question is a logistical question, which is how could she travel all the way from New York through New Jersey into Pennsylvania? Because Alexander is in Philadelphia. So could she do this alone? And it's a little bit of a trick question. And you're going to see she doesn't do it alone. She has help. And it's a fascinating part of this story. So we're going to answer the question of how would she have been able to do it? And some of the historians may know, in fact, I think most of them already know very well that at this time, prior to the adoption of the Constitution, and I'll use Jefferson as an example, it was common to consider your state as your country. Jefferson famously referred to himself as a Virginian, and then he was an American, but he was a Virginian first. So effectively, Eliza would be going from her home state of New York through a separate state of New Jersey into Pennsylvania, which is almost as if you're traveling through three separate countries. So this is a big deal to travel this kind of a distance at the time. And what about childcare? She's got three kids, the Hamiltons. What happens with the kids? And here I'm pointing out the bottom bullet that this document was sold by Sotheby's in 2017. It's cataloged in the Hamilton papers by Professor Cyrette, and he's from Columbia. He did, I think, I forgot how many volumes, 26 volumes or so of the Hamilton papers. So the document itself is not a secret, but when you combine this document with some of these other documents, this is how you begin to piece together the story. So let's get started. So, and I'm referring to it as the undated letter, the undated love letter. So when I refer to the undated love letter, this is the letter we're talking about. And the language in the middle in the black box is what I think is most important as we go page by page through the slides. So Alexander is saying, I cannot yet determine what will be our stay here. In other words, I don't know how long I'm going to be stuck in this city. And he doesn't say what city he's in. So I can't yet determine. I feel it would be impossible for me to submit to a long separation. And I think, as we're going to talk about later, I think this is an invitation. He's saying to her, it's impossible for me to be without you. I miss you. And he goes on to say at the end of the letter, give my love to my darling Philip. And Philip is the oldest child, and kiss all possible tenderness the other two. So we know there are three children, and that's one of the ways that we can try to date the letter. And I've got two observations at the bottom that, based upon what's underlined here, these criteria that he's unable to predict how long is this going to last, that perfectly aligns with the Constitutional Convention. And he's also suggesting that it's going to be a long separation, which also aligns with the Constitutional Convention. So the next piece of the letter I want to talk about, continuing to read the letter, he says that 3 or 4 days since I wrote to my angel, so since I wrote to Eliza 3 or 4 days ago by post, by mail, since which I have received a letter from her. So he's already received a letter from Eliza. I feel it would be impossible for me to submit to a long separation, however inconvenient it may be to incur the expense which will attend her coming here. So what can we infer from this passage? That it's inconvenient for her to travel because it's not as if she's going back to Albany or going somewhere else in New York. So this is going to be an inconvenient trip and possibly leaving behind the kids. And he's also saying it's going to be expensive. So that also aligns with going all the way from New York to Philadelphia. But this doesn't prove anything yet. This is all suggestive. So you should be saying to me with a skeptical voice, all right, Adam, that's nice, but you need more in order to make your case. So hold your horses. Let's continue with the letter. So we're trying to date it. When was this letter written? So he ends by saying, give my love to my darling Philip and kiss with all possible tenderness the other two. So if you look at the Hamilton family tree, the third child was Alexander, and he was born in 1786. And the fourth child, who hasn't been born yet, was born in April of 1788, which gives us basically a 2-year window from 86 to 88. And Professor Cyrette in the Hamilton papers dates the letter between May of 86 and April of 88. And I'm arguing today that it was May to June of 1787. We can be more precise. And one of the letters we're going to be relying on, so this is coming up around the corner, is Henry Knox's letter of June 8. And I don't think that Cyrette had access to this Henry Knox letter, which is pretty explosive, as you're going to see. So we'll talk about Knox in a minute, but let's continue with this love letter. So some of you, and this group, you're all Hamilton enthusiasts and Hamilton experts. So I know some of you probably have been mouthing to yourselves, okay, Adam, it doesn't prove anything because it could have been the Annapolis Convention. If I could see all your faces, I suspect some of you are smiling. Yeah, prove to me it wasn't Annapolis. So let's keep reading. 3 or 4 days since I wrote to my angel, in which I received a letter from her. And he says, I need consolation. Things potentially aren't going well. So remember that the Annapolis Convention only lasted 4 days. That's September 11th to September 14th. And he may have been there a couple of days earlier. But suffice it to say, the Annapolis Convention is relatively short. And also, we happen to have a letter that Alexander does send from Annapolis, which is dated September 8th, which is also in the Hamilton papers. And he says in his September 8th letter from 86 that he anticipated the prospect of being in Annapolis from 8 to 10 days, or maybe a fortnight, which would have been 2 weeks. So, in other words, that September 8th letter from Annapolis really rules out the possibility that the love letter was also written from Annapolis. And we can debate about this during the chat. So, we're comparing how from Annapolis, we know he says it's going to be 8 to 10 days, but this love letter, he's saying it's indeterminate. I do not know how long I'm going to be stuck here. And then the last little bit of evidence is the letter from Annapolis. He sends it to Eliza in Albany. So in 1786, Eliza is in Albany, but we do know from the love letter that it's sent to New York City. So that's another reason why we should not confuse the two letters. So there's very good evidence that she's in New York, which means it wouldn't have been in 1786 when he's in Annapolis. All right, but again, this doesn't prove anything. This is all suggestive. And I know that the Hamilton scholars on this group chat, this discussion, you need more. So again, just wait. So we've been ruling out Annapolis. Let's see if I can keep moving ahead. All right, so this is letter number 2, the Henry Knox letter. And when I saw this letter for the first time, I basically fell out of my chair and I started contacting some of my historian colleagues and friends who are the real experts, including Professor Kaminsky, who I believe is who's attending with us today. So the key language from this Henry Knox letter, and you can see the date at the top. The letter is dated June 8th of 1787. And at the very end of the letter, Henry Knox, writing to Rufus King, says that Miss Hamilton is going to be in our party coming to Philadelphia. So Henry Knox is going to be coming to Philadelphia, and he drops at the very end this statement that Miss Hamilton is going to be coming. All right. So this is so everybody can see a visual. That's Henry Knox near the cannon, and we can talk about why you would pose Knox with a cannon, which is all famous stories about Henry Knox. And this is Lucy Knox, his wife. We don't have a portrait, or at least I couldn't find a portrait of her, but this is a visual representation of her hairstyle and what she looked like. And there are great stories about Henry and Lucy. So those are our characters that we're talking about. So let's get into this June 8th letter. So the first question is, just because the letter says that Miss Hamilton is to be of our party, a skeptic would say there are other Hamiltons. In fact, in Pennsylvania, there's a very famous and very wealthy Hamilton family, no relation to Alexander and Eliza. So which Miss Hamilton? And I'm arguing, of course, that it was Eliza who's going to be coming into town with Henry Knox. And of course, the second bullet, even if Henry was planning to come to Philadelphia on June 8th, it doesn't mean that he actually does come to Philadelphia. And I'm arguing that, yes, he absolutely does come, and we've got the proof. I'm going to give you the receipts. The third bullet here is, did Eliza in fact come with Henry? Even if Henry was planning on coming to Philadelphia, that doesn't mean that she actually was able to do it, because sometimes you have an objective, doesn't mean that you can actually connect the dots. So yes, we've got proof. You're going to see that Eliza does come to Philadelphia. And another question is, how do we know and what can we gather about this trip from Henry Knox coming to Philadelphia? And the answer is, it was planned, but it was delayed. So you're going to see how all these pieces fit together, and you're going to keep saying to yourself, Adam, it's nice for you to say this, prove it. So hold your horses and sit tight. All right. So Henry begins by thanking Rufus King from a prior letter of June 3rd, and that tells us that Henry Knox is in communication with Rufus King. So this is not an isolated letter. These are folks that are talking to one another, and it makes sense, because if you know who Henry Knox is, he's from Massachusetts. He's our Secretary of War, and Rufus King is a delegate to the Constitutional Convention from Massachusetts. So the two of them have been writing back and forth, and Knox provides news from Massachusetts and updates. And one of the examples of the updates that he gives is he's pointing out how New Hampshire and Rhode Island still haven't sent delegates, and and you've got some details about how Knox is bemoaning the fact that there are some issues with politics in Massachusetts, and he's also, and I think this is useful but not relevant to our thesis today, but Knox is pointing out how, the thinking part of the community, in other words, those who understand the gravity of the issues facing America, realize that the convention has to come up with solutions. God grant that they may not be disappointed. So, Henry Knox is part of the team, if you will, the strong nationalists who hope that the convention is going to be a success. So how does the letter end? The letter ends by saying, at the very end of the letter, I have been detained here for longer than I expected, because remember, he's planning to come, but he was detained. I shall set out on Sunday, which is June the 10th, and probably be in Philadelphia with Mrs. Knox on Tuesday, June 12th. And then you have that sentence, which blew my mind. Mrs. Hamilton is to be of our party. So again, you're going to say Adam doesn't prove anything. Maybe they were hoping to come, and maybe that was Mrs. Hamilton, but we need more. So let's keep plodding ahead. All right. So I'm pointing out to you now that this was not the first letter that Knox sends, and he'd previously written, this is Rufus King now, had written to Henry on June 3rd, saying that he's expecting Mrs. King and myself expect you and Mrs. Knox. So this tells us that Mrs. King and Mrs. Knox are both going to be in Philadelphia. But interestingly, that letter from June 3rd doesn't mention Eliza. So, Rufus King is planning on coming back to Philadelphia, and Henry Knox rather. Henry Knox is planning on returning to Philadelphia. And Henry Knox had previously been there earlier in May at a meeting of the Society of the Cincinnati. And there's another letter you can look at in May of 2029. Knox sends a letter to George Washington, and he tells George Washington that he's going to be coming to Philadelphia with his wife in a few days. So again, you can see that Henry Knox was certainly planning on coming to Philadelphia. And then Washington writes back to Knox, and Washington says on May 31st in a letter that I'm pleased that we might flatter ourselves with the expectation of seeing Mrs. Knox and you. And another interesting tidbit is that when Washington writes back to Henry Knox, you can really see that it only takes 3 days for the mail to travel from New York City to Philadelphia, because that's where Henry Knox was when these letters are being written. So the well-established carriage lines can travel, and I don't think it would be an easy trip because it's probably, you're probably in the carriage going a breakneck pace without much rest except for staying overnight. But the point is that, it can be done in 3 days. There's lots of good examples of how messages get delivered in 3 days. And the point of this slide is that it was known to Washington, and it was known to Rufus King that Henry would be coming to town with his wife Lucy. But nowhere does this mention that Eliza was going to be part of the party. So let's give some more background about this letter. And additional background is, for those who really get into the weeds, this letter is not contained in Max Ferrand's 1911 compendium, which I referred to here as the canonical records of the convention. And most of the biographies and historians who focus on this period of time, many stories of the convention, everybody cites to Max Ferrand because it's pretty authoritative, or they cite to James Hudson, who did the update to Max Ferrand, and that was in 1987. So neither Hudson nor Ferrand have these letters in their collections. Also, Paul Hubert, who wrote the letters, which is also multi-volumes, probably in the neighborhood of 26, 27 volumes, doesn't have all of these letters in his collection of letters of delegates to Congress. And these are the usual places that historians will look when they're writing, these authoritative biographies and stories. So how do you explain this omission of these letters? And again, I think it's because it's not included in these texts that historians rely on, which makes the point sometimes get into the weeds, and you have to go to the archives. So more information about Knox, that he wasn't a convention delegate, and Knox was not a member of Congress. And that may explain why there's a little bit of an oversight that his letter wasn't included by Ferrand. And King, though, Rufus King was both a member of Congress, a delegate to Congress, and Rufus King was also a member of the convention. And the way I found the letter, by the way, is that Rufus King's grandson, and his name is Charles King, did compile some of his correspondence, and that's where I found it in 1894. But for whatever reason, it was overlooked by some others. So we're going to explain why this letter is so important as we go forward and connect it to some others. So The other point I want to make is just because Knox says that he's planning on coming, it doesn't prove that he actually does come. And Henry Knox and Lucy have children. So at the Massachusetts Historical Society and other locations, I wanted to get into all of Henry Knox's letters and all of Rufus King's letters to see if I could connect the dots. And the answer is we've got good proof. There are multiple letters of Henry Knox writing to his brother William, and William answers the child care questions. And William Knox, that's Henry's brother, is taking care of the children. So, and I don't give all the dates of the letters, but the most useful one is June 14th, where William writes to his brother Henry that the children are perfectly well. And I give you some of the excerpts that Marcus and Caroline are in perfect health. So that tells us that Henry and Lucy have left behind two of the children with their uncle, and they bring little Lucy. So Henry Knox and Lucy have a daughter, Lucy. So they bring their oldest daughter with them to Philadelphia. And this all becomes clear when you read the correspondence between the two brothers, the two Knox brothers. But again, Adam, you haven't proven anything yet. You're telling a nice story, but you still have to connect the dots. So this is where we get the definitive proof. So our next document is a letter from Dr. Shippen. So this is our fourth letter, and this closes the deal, if you will. So this letter from Dr. Shippen is dated June 19th of 1787, and you can see it's dated Philadelphia, June 19th. And a little bit of background about Dr. Shippen. He's a prominent physician in Philadelphia. He's well connected. And his wife, Alice Shippen, is a Lee from Virginia, the Virginia Lee dynasty. So the Shippens were very friendly with the Virginians. And what Dr. Shippen is doing, he's writing to his son, and his son Thomas is studying in England at the time. And he's explaining that all these delegates are coming to town, and many of them are stopping by and saying hello and having meals and being entertained at what they fondly refer to as the Virginia Hotel, which is where the Shippens are living. So Dr. Shippen, who was also friendly, by the way, with Henry Knox, and it's fascinating to read these letters where the Shippens are discussing their visitors in Philadelphia in June. But again, this isn't proof yet, but wait till you see what's going to happen next. So if you look at this slide, you can see the letter is sent to Thomas Lee Shippen. He's at the Inner Temple. He's in London, and it's the father keeping his son up to date. And I'm referring to this as a remarkable letter. So a little bit more background. The letter I'm pointing out, notwithstanding the rule of secrecy, that the delegates are not supposed to share information about what's going on, it's pretty clear that Dr. Shippen is getting inside information about some of the proceedings in Philadelphia. For example, he says the convention was busy and secret. That's good that it's secret. But he also points out that the convention secretary, his name is William Jackson. William Jackson is observing that Colonel Hamilton spoke 3 hours yesterday. The letter is dated June 19th, and Hamilton spoke 3 hours yesterday is June 18th. We know that. Hamilton gives an all-day speech that day, but Jackson is sharing to Shippen that Colonel Hamilton spoke yesterday, and Jackson says, well. So this is reliable information because this aligns with what we know from Madison's notes, but doesn't prove anything yet, but get ready. All right, so here is where it all comes together. So after mentioning Hamilton's long speech, Shippen compliments the convention as learned and good group. And more information, they talk about sitting for 2 or 3 months longer, because we know this convention, it's not easy. There are all kinds of compromises, some good, some bad, that they have to make. I hope and believe it will be for good purpose. And then after this statement about Hamilton and the delegates, the letter says as follows: General Washington, Colonel and Mrs. Hamilton, and it mentions some other prominent Philadelphia folks, the Binghams, the Powells, the Coxes, made your sister's party last evening. So put it all together. June 19th, this is the date of the letter, describing the party on the 18th. And you see General Washington is attending the party with Colonel and Mrs. Hamilton. That's the proof, because the other Hamilton family in Philadelphia was not a Colonel Hamilton, because the other prominent Hamilton was actually a loyalist during the war. So that's the other Hamilton family. But this is Colonel Hamilton, bingo. And Mrs. Hamilton, that's Eliza. This is the proof. And it's fascinating, maybe in the chat or after we can talk about this, that notice the sequence. So it's mentioning Washington, and Hamilton and Eliza are presumably standing next to each other, hanging out at the party. So what's the conclusion when you take these letters together? Taken together, there can be no doubt that Mrs. Hamilton in the Knox letter is Eliza Hamilton when you combine it with the Shippen letter. And if we were all in the room together, I'd pause to ask questions. But let's keep plowing ahead. So, in hindsight, this is try to pull it together. It is not surprising, in hindsight, to say that Eliza was in Philadelphia on June 18th. And why do I say it's not surprising? Because this is a consequential day. For Hamiltonians, we love June 18th because that's the day that Hamilton, in a way, breaks his silence. And he'd spoken early on in the convention about the Committee on Rules, and there's some early action that he does, but he'd largely been silent for reasons we can talk about later, having to do with the composition of his delegation. And when you look at Madison's notes, and I'm quoting now, Mr. Hamilton had hitherto been silent on the business before the convention, but he breaks his silence on June 18th to assail the New Jersey and the Virginia plans. And when you look at Samuel Johnson's diary, and William Samuel Johnson is a Connecticut delegate, he's very important with the Connecticut Compromise, and he's also on a very important committee at the end with Hamilton. He becomes the president of Columbia University, which at the time was King's College during the war. But Johnson, in his diary, keeps track during the convention, and it doesn't have much detail. But on June 18th, the only word that appears of substance is Hamilton. The reason why is that Hamilton is giving an all-day speech on June 18th. So I'm also pointing out here that Eliza had a motive to be in Philadelphia because presumably she may have known that he was going to give this all-day speech on June 18th. Maybe Alexander told her, and maybe she motivated him to give that speech. We can speculate about that. She had the means and the opportunity to come. And I'm pointing out that during the war, Eliza was not a shrinking violet. She traveled to Valley Forge. There's good evidence that, there's not even a debate about that she and other wives would travel from time to time. And she would often go to visit her parents in Albany, the Schuyler estate. So, this is consistent that Eliza, even though she's not traveling with Alexander, that she would leave home to go to the convention. And I'm smiling when I say that, to go to Philadelphia, I wouldn't want to give up that opportunity to go to the largest, the shopping mall, if you will, in Philadelphia, and the opportunity to meet with everybody. It's a wonderful opportunity to go to Philadelphia, a cosmopolitan city. So here I'm asking questions that maybe we can get into during the chat. So Hamilton is listed immediately after Washington. We talked about that. Does that have any implications? And often biographers will say that Hamilton only had a cordial relationship with Washington. The two of them were professional, but they weren't personal friends. And I think there's some debate about that. And, according to the letter, presumably the two of them are talking to one another at the party, socializing. And here I'm asking the broader question, and I want other historians to join into this research. What role were the wives playing? And these social parties taking place in Philadelphia, were these social lubricants for some of the heated debates that were taking place in the convention? What could be going on behind the scenes? There's a lot I don't think we still know. And did Hamilton let Eliza know that he'd be returning? And here I'm asking a different question, which is Hamilton's going to leave Philadelphia at the end of June to go back to New York. And does he let the other delegates know that he's going to return to New York with Eliza? And I think that's probably what happens. I think he does go back to New York with Eliza on June 30th. And, how much of that information is he and she sharing with everybody? So there are all kinds of questions about when Hamilton leaves, the reasons he leaves, and that's a whole separate conversation. So here at the very last bullet, I'm pointing out that biographers often say that Hamilton, invariably, they say that Hamilton left on June 30th because he was frustrated with Yates and Lansing, who were the other two New York delegates, that he was frustrated because he can't get his Hamilton plan, which he introduces on June 18th, and that this guy, and I don't believe it, but a lot of historians think that, this guy is frustrated, Hamilton, and, he just barges off. And, my view is that even though he's not accomplishing what he wants yet, I think he had good reasons to come back, and he had good reasons to leave, realizing that he is going to come back. So when you look at what Hamilton explains during the ratification debates, he says the reasons that he leaves is for private business. In other words, legal disputes and legal work that he had to do. Also, and this is here I want to do a shout out to Sergio and Professor Kaminsky. We proved a couple years ago that Hamilton was not being paid at the time, unlike the Virginians and a lot of the other delegates. The New Yorkers don't get paid until in 1788. So that may be another reason why he left in June. And as we said, his role was limited by the New York delegation. He always gets outvoted by Yates and Lansing, who I would call anti-federalists, but that term isn't used yet. Also, as you know, the convention is in deadlock in June. And there are good reasons why, even if he stayed in June, it's not necessary necessarily the case that he would have been accomplishing anything. So he shoots all his argument on the June 18th is when he lays down what I think Professor Kaminsky would point out is, a bookend which helps move along the Virginia plan, away from the New Jersey plan. And we can talk about that if we have time. So what else can we infer from the letter? And here I want to give an example how the 1987, this is the Hudson supplement to Farrand. It only has a transcript of the Shippen letter, and this is all that Professor Hudson, and Hudson, by the way, worked at the Library of Congress. And this makes the point that it's only an excerpt, and that's the danger when historians only give excerpts. You don't know what they're leaving out, and that's one of the reasons why I always like to try to get the full excerpt or the full manuscript and read it for myself, rather than relying upon an excerpt. And excerpts can be dangerous because a historian who's putting together someone's papers may have certain agendas or may not be thinking about social history. So again, what I consider to be an explosive letter, only 3 or so sentences of it are contained in Hudson's supplement from 1987. So we're continuing now with what I'm going to now describe as another revelation from 1787 about Fanny Antill. And if you were to Google Little Orphan Fanny, and I encourage people, if you want to do that, you're going to find out this other discovery that we recently made dealing with Fanny. And when you read some of the biographies, and I'm going to quote Chernow here, Chernow, and this is no secret, the Hamiltons in July of 1787, they bring this little girl, a 2-year-old, into their household. So they have a growing family of their own, and they take in this little orphan. And Chernow refers to this as an exceptional act of kindness. So they bring 2-year-old Fanny home, and then she lives and is treated as their own child for a decade until she later moves in with her older sister. And Fanny's father's name is Edward Antill, and he becomes a widower. The wife dies in 1785, and then he dies in 1787. So the Hamiltons bring in this little girl, and when you read John Church Hamilton's biography of his father, he describes how, and I'm quoting here, that Colonel Antill visited New York to solicit the aid of the Cincinnati, and Hamilton immediately took little orphan Fanny home. And I'm going to point out that there's more to this story, that it was not spontaneous. So we've got more information that we've uncovered about the Anhills and the Hamiltons. So go to the next slide. So Angelica, and everyone knows from the musical, Angelica is Eliza's sister, one of the sisters. She writes a letter from England, and here we're quoting that Angelica says, "All the graces you have been pleased to adorn me with fade before the generous and benevolent action of my sister in taking the orphan Antill under her protection." And that's another spelling of the name Antill. But the point is that Eliza's she's extraordinarily how should we say, she's overwhelmed with how generous it was for her sister to bring in another orphan into the growing family. And I won't say another orphan, but to bring in an orphan into the family. Maybe Alexander we could consider to be an orphan also. So although the exact date when the Hamiltons bring Fanny home is not known, Angelica's letter is dated October 2nd. So we know that the bringing little Fanny home had to have occurred before October 2nd. And my argument is that it was probably on July 5th, because there was a meeting of the Society of the Cincinnati in New York on July 5th. And it takes about 6 weeks, depending on weather, for a ship to sail from New York City to London. So that's probably why I think July 5th is almost certainly when little Fanny comes home with Alexander. And I don't want to diminish the generosity of the Hamilton family, which I believe is absolutely very generous and consistent with the Hamiltons taking care of orphans and the work they did for the New York Manumission Society and other groups. But it's what I'm arguing today, and you'll see the reasons why, was that Eliza had been Fanny's godmother 2 years earlier. So there's an existing relationship between the Antill and the Hamilton family, and you're going to now see this pre-existing family relationship, which gets very interesting. So how do I make the case that the Hamiltons and the Antills knew each other? Hamilton fought with Edward, who was also a lieutenant at Yorktown. Hamilton was in the 2nd Battalion and Antill was in the 3rd Battalion. And by the way, they were neighbors in New York City. So it made sense that they knew each other from New York, from Wall Street. And Fanny later marries, by the way, Arthur Tappan, who's a prominent anti-slavery abolitionist. And then Fanny's older sister marries a Lansing, which tells you how this is a small world. So I won't go through all of the sources that support this, but the biographies and the genealogical records make very clear what I'm about to show you. So we're now going to go to an example of, this is a newspaper. The top is a newspaper advertisement from Colonel Antill. That the point here is that his office is on Broadway and Wall Street. And below that is from the New York Directory from 1786. And you can see that Alexander lives with Eliza at 57 Wall Street, which presumably is only a couple blocks or a couple streets or even a couple houses from where Antill lives, also Broadway and Wall Street. So the two of them are basically neighbors. And here I'm making the argument that Antill was also a member, Edward, of the Society of Cincinnati. And not only was he a member, he was a chair of the Southern District. It was divided into different groups. So Antill wasn't just showing up at a Society of Cincinnati meeting. He was a leader in the Society of Cincinnati. And the document at the bottom just shows that he was a lieutenant colonel in the Hazen Regiment. And that was one of the, as we said earlier, one of the regiments that's involved fighting at Yorktown. And a lot of the Hamiltonians on this presentation all are very familiar with the Battle of Yorktown. So the third revelation I want to share, which I think is also exciting, is this gentleman on the left is the governor of New Jersey. He was the first New Jersey governor, because New Jersey used to be part of New York. He is the first standalone New Jersey governor. His name is Lewis Morris. And when you look at Lewis Morris's son, who's also Lewis Morris, and the historians refer to the son as Judge Morris. So Judge Morris in his family Bible has the following. And the Bible reads that he has a son named Gouverneur, and this is Gouverneur Morris. And I know that Tim is on, and Tim did a presentation a couple weeks ago about Gouverneur Morris, who was a good Hamilton friend. So the Gouverneur Morris that we know from the Constitutional Convention is named after his wife's father, Nicholas Gouverneur. And what's important for my purposes about the family Bible and other records is that the relative, the Antill, the sister, becomes the godmother of Gouverneur Morris. So I'll say that again, and I'll say it several times, that Gouverneur Morris is related to the Antills, which shows you in this family tree how we have the governor at the top, Governor Lewis Morris. We have Judge Lewis Morris, who is the father of Gouverneur Morris. And I want to make sure people don't confuse Governor Morris, who is the governor of New Jersey, with Gouverneur Morris. And I always pronounce it wrong, and there are different pronunciations. So Gouverneur Morris, who is our friend from the Constitutional Convention, is a cousin of Colonel Antill, and Colonel Antill is the father of Fanny. And hopefully we'll get some time to talk about why I think this is an important relationship. And let's tie it together. So Fanny's grandmother is Anne Morris Antill, is Gouverneur Morris's aunt, which means that Gouverneur Morris and Edward Antill were both first cousins. They are all the grandchildren of New Jersey Governor Lewis Morris. And Fanny's grandmother would have been Gouverneur Morris's godmother. That's another connection in these records, the family genealogies. And what does this mean? It means that when Hamilton and Gouverneur Morris were drafting the Constitution together in September, when they do the final draft of the Constitution, including the preamble, Eliza was back in Philadelphia. I'm sorry, Eliza was back in New York City raising little Fanny. So this shows the connections between the Morris and the Hamilton and Antill family. So I like to say it's a small world, but it's not surprising. And I think some of the skeptics in the audience are already asking the question, well, why doesn't Gouverneur Morris take home Fanny? Because Gouverneur Morris was a blood relative as opposed to the Hamiltons, who are not blood relatives. And I think a lot of the Hamilton experts and Gouverneur Morris experts know that Gouverneur Morris, who I love, Gouverneur Morris, was not married until he's in his 50s. So he did not have a wife and family. So it made sense for little Fanny to go to a family, lives in the same neighborhood where she'd have other kids her age. So these are the connections that we're drawing together. And in a few more minutes remaining, and you'll all let me know how much time we have, we're going to now talk about what else was Eliza doing that summer. So this portrait over here on the left is another act of generosity by Eliza. And this portrait was made when Eliza wanted to help raise money for the artist. His name was Ralph Earl. And this is described in one of the books written by James Hamilton, another Hamilton relative. And James Hamilton describes how when Earl went into debtor's prison, Eliza agreed to sit for a portrait in jail And Eliza tried to induce other ladies to do the same. Let's raise some money to help get the guy out of jail. So another example of the generosity of the Hamilton family, which knew no bounds, in my opinion. So here, just to give some other examples of portraits. So these are other famous portraits. The one on the right is Eliza in 1795. And here is, I think, the final portrait of Eliza in the 1840s. That's at the Smithsonian. And I want to point out to some of the folks, when we look at these letters, these are what archives look like. So Sergio is very familiar with the New York archives on the top left. The Huntington is in the middle. This is where some of the Rufus King and Henry Knox papers are located. The manuscript reading room at the Library of Congress, that's the family jewels, or the one at the bottom right. So these are what archival libraries look like. And in my view, often, a lot of these documents have not thoroughly been studied. There is still work to do. So we are almost finished, and I want to make sure I'm extending thanks to my uncle who went to some of these archives. Eunho Young, a student at the University of Pennsylvania, did some of the heavy lifting for me. My mentor and my hero, Professor Kaminsky. Some of the other folks at the Massachusetts Historical Society, I won't read all the names, and some of the other historical societies, Gilder Lerman, the folks at Independence National Historical Park, if they still have a job, thank you for everything you do. We need these civil servants doing the heavy work of preserving these records. And the Library of Congress, thank you, everybody, for what you do and what you make possible. And of course, thank you to the AHA Society for allowing these presentations, which I think are so valuable to bring the community together. So that will conclude, I hope, giving us plenty of time to focus on some I know of the excellent questions that everyone's going to have to contribute and share with me and disagree with me. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Well, I hope that everyone joins me in a very hearty round of applause for Adam, because I'm just so excited about the research you continue to do. And on a personal note, it's just amazing. I think one of the things that's interesting for those that study Hamilton is that there's still so much more to discover, and there's still so much to fill in the blanks of the historical record. And you, Adam, certainly are at the forefront of filling in those blanks. And so we at the AHA Society are so indebted to your dedication and just how you're able to really highlight the importance of these archives and bringing together these disparate pieces of information to completely change narratives in a lot of cases. I mean, because of you, I'm going to go have to rewrite my entire presentation on Eliza and the Constitution because of this new discovery that you've put together. And so I just really just want to echo, I'm sure many of the other people on this presentation just are all of all the work that you do. And I want to encourage everyone, they have not visited statutesandstories.com, that it really, this is just one example of the incredibly in-depth research that Adam does, and especially regarding Hamilton and the US Constitution, broadening our understanding of that. I also really want to say an appreciation for how you're able to highlight all of these familial and social connections, because I think it really gives context to these different names and why they might have, as you showed with Fanny Antill, had adopted Fanny Antill. And I think that's amazing. And one thing that a commenter mentioned, that they thought they figured out the Philadelphia surprise, is that not only in July of 1787 did they adopt Fanny, but it also was that month that likely James Alexander was conceived while Hamilton was home from the convention. So acting Secretary of State, thanks to Hamilton's return to New York City, as you mentioned. So we do want to open up for questions. I do see a couple, but we certainly want to hear what else you thought. And I thought it was really interesting, Adam, about the Knox connection, and it makes complete sense that Eliza would have traveled with the Knoxes. Speaking of those social connections, the Hamiltons and the Knoxes were very close, as were the Washingtons, when Hamilton and Eliza were newlyweds, and Hamilton was still aide de camp to Washington. They were, of course, living in these winter headquarters together. So Eliza and Martha would have lived together, the Knoxes would have been at a house nearby, and so they really would have been at the forefront of leading the social activities of these winter encampments. And we're very, very close friends on a personal level. And so I really appreciated you adding that context, because I think it really, the social component of the negotiations after hours from the convention, I think really can't be understated, and really quite amazing, some of the information you shared. There was a question here from Michelle. Why was it so important to Alexander that he wanted Eliza to be at the convention with him? Why was it so important to them to be together? And she was curious, do we have any proof of codependency? And so just curious your thoughts of why you think that Hamilton really wanted Eliza in that moment.
So I could speculate all day long, and let me go back to react, and I'll get to Michelle's question in a second. That Eliza traveled with Henry Knox, as you're suggesting, it made perfect sense. I mean, who better for Eliza to travel with than the Secretary of War and the Secretary of War's wife, and also their young daughter, Lucy Knox. So the stars all align here. And then Michelle's asking an excellent question, which is, what else can we tease together? And personally, I think that he probably missed her a lot. And some of the other delegates had their family there, and it wasn't easy for him to be the one New Yorker. And a lot of the folks know that Hamilton is the only New Yorker who signs. When I say New Yorker, only member of the New York delegation to sign the Constitution. And he's trying to push the convention in a certain direction, and he's sort of pushing uphill. There's a boulder that he's trying to move. And I think that Eliza, and this is me speaking, I would like others to try to prove it, but I think that Eliza was probably a source of strength for him. And I think that socially, she may have been able behind the scenes at some of these parties to, and in other words, I'm going to answer it this way, and I welcome reaction by other professors and others, but I think that it is not a coincidence, and I say this all the time, and you have to prove it, but I think it's not a coincidence that she's there on June 18th, which is the day that he gives his all-day speech. I don't think that's a coincidence. Maybe she was giving him some mojo, maybe he wanted, maybe he's rehearsing it with her the night before. Maybe she's his muse, that he runs ideas past her. There are examples of him reading, and she's helping him with the Federalist Papers, transcribing, etc. So these are the unanswered questions that we're teasing out, and I welcome other historians. Don't think that we know everything about these stories. I think there's a lot we know, but I think there's a lot that remains to be seen that we may never know. And that's the honest answer to Michelle. So keep asking those questions, and we need resources to PhD programs and to historians to look at the social history. So for many years we have the battle history, we have the military and the legal history, but there's still a lot to be done.
Thank you, Adam. And I think especially the fact that we're highlighting this event for Women's History Month, I appreciate you talking about how the social component should not be overlooked, that focus has maybe been on the political writings or the wartime contributions, but the social component that binds everyone together and keeps the peace and makes those negotiations and those compromises happen really were fueled by the women. So I think it's very powerful to note how important it is. Their contributions, even if they weren't in the historical record, were very heavily present. And I'm inclined to agree with you that it's very likely that Hamilton wanted Eliza to be there specifically if he knew he would be giving some sort of talk. I think one thing that's very important to keep in mind is that George Washington was the one who decided who had the floor and who spoke at the convention. So I think it's also no surprise that Washington, and of course this wouldn't have been sprung on him the day before if Hamilton spoke for 3 hours. We know he can churn out things very quickly, but he also would have taken a lot of time to prepare. So likely he knew that this would be coming at some point. And so it makes complete sense to me that he would want Eliza there, because we do have other instances where she did assist him, either staying up all night and copying out his writings for him, or probably just being a presence of a soundboard for him to work out his ideas on, as one of his people that he would confer with. And so I think that highlight the fact that we do have evidence of that in other instances where he had to pull all-nighters for political writings or that she helped copy out essays that were going to be published in the newspaper, it certainly makes sense that he would probably rely on her for something of this nature. And
So
so it's yeah, it's just really an interesting aspect to it. And also another important thing is that it was not just that Hamilton was asked to speak on June 18th and that was it. The very next day they were going to be having a major vote. And so it was very uh intentional that they would have Hamilton speak on the 18th. And of course there's a lot of supposition on why Washington would have selected Hamilton to be the only person to have the floor for an all day speech. And so, yes, Adam, please.
yeah, I wanted to make the point, and these are research trails for others to pick up, and this may not result in anything going further. But if I had time, I would look at the following, and I eventually will try to do it. But the other wives that were in Philadelphia, to make the point about what we don't know, but the other wives that were definitely there. Edmund Randolph is the governor of Virginia. His wife is in Philadelphia. The South Carolinians, their wives, in fact, one of them, one of the Pinckneys, and the Pinckney family is a fascinating family. Had recently been married about a year or so prior, if I'm remembering correctly, and he has maybe not have been a year, but basically is has an anniversary to celebrate. So the point is that Eliza very well, I would have loved to know what Eliza is talking about at some of these dinner parties and tea parties with the governor's wife of Virginia, who was one of the most politically powerful people there, and by looking at the papers of the Randolph wives, and I should say the Pinckney family papers of the wives. Are there little hints that they met Eliza? And then you can infer when they met Eliza. And of course, she'll later be in Philadelphia when the Philadelphia becomes the nation's capital. This is in 1790. But I think there's a lot of other areas, other rivers and tributaries that can be explored to try to make these social connections between some of the wives and the politics. And I would say that getting Edmund Randolph on your side, and he's one of those who doesn't sign the Constitution at the end, but early on he's a very pro-federalist, if you will, embracing the Virginia plan. So there's a lot going on behind the scenes, and one of these days we'll talk about the Yates returns discovery, which is just another example how there's a lot that historians have overlooked. And we did a presentation on that a couple of years ago, and I'm doing a shout out to Sergio and to Professor Kaminsky. So I welcome questions and I welcome pushback and scholarship on these topics.
Perfect. We do have a question from Timothy Shantz, our presenter from last month. Do Eliza and/or Alexander or any others share their reactions to the reception of his oration of the 18th?
So I would defer to some of the other historians who may be more familiar with some of the other writings, but I'm not aware of Hamilton sharing contemporaneously his reaction to his speech. And unfortunately, there isn't much debate about his speech. And I know that William Samuel Johnson, if I'm remembering correctly, writes or is observed saying that Hamilton's speech, and I'm paraphrasing, was appreciated, admired by everybody, but followed by none. So in other words, they understood his reasoning, the arguments he's making, but they ultimately disagreed with pushing the envelope as far as he wants to do with regard to the Hamilton plan. And as I said earlier, I think most historians agree that he does, by putting another marker, by laying out that marker, it makes the Virginia plan less conservative because Hamilton is putting forward an even more conservative, and let's be careful when I use the word conservative, but I'm not aware of Hamilton describing the reaction. But basically, a lot of the historians basically say that most people ignored his underlying proposals, but I think they understood his reasoning.
And I have heard it posited that Hamilton made that speech to be more and I'm looking for the right word, but intensive or more skewed to one side, so that the actual plan that George Washington and others were really purporting or proposing would seem more middle ground if Hamilton proposed. So there's a lot of supposition that it was really intentional, that Hamilton's plan, maybe he knew it was going to be too bold, his plan for the Constitution, it was too bold, but that really the function of it in these behind the scenes meetings and social interactions was that it made the plans that that Washington really wanted to get forward be more well received and appear more in the center. Uh, oh yes, Adam, please.
Yeah, so I completely concur with what you said, and I'll add to it that even Hamilton, when he presented his written plan, he didn't think that they would adopt it, but he's putting it down as a marker that, over time in the future, this is the ideal that he wanted to see, and under the convention rules of secrecy, it was not supposed to be shared outside of the convention. And I've got a post on Statutes and Stories where I found a newspaper publication where it was leaked, if you will, years earlier than when the convention, before Madison dies, before Madison's papers get released, Hamilton's proposal gets released, and that's a whole separate conversation. But so I don't think Hamilton would have been frustrated on the 18th, because I think he understood that there was a process, and I think the historians are too harsh on him when they say he runs off out of frustration. I think it's more complicated than that.
And as you mentioned, really all of these proposals were meant to be secretive and in confidence, so not necessarily that Hamilton ever thought it would be leaked for posterity of what he was proposing. You did mention at one point in your presentation that Eliza had been at Valley Forge. Michael Newton points out that he doesn't, I'm not aware either that she had ever been at Valley Forge in 1777. Perhaps you were thinking of Morristown when she was in Morristown, New Jersey, and met Hamilton in 1780 at the winter encampment.
Sorry. So I leave it to Michael Newton to correct me, and I always want to be corrected. The point I was trying to make, and that's what happens when you don't give a citation, that during the war she would, meet up with, and Morristown, absolutely. But when it came to Yorktown, I agree. She was not at Yorktown. So if I said that, then that's incorrect, and I will correct it. So thank you, Michael.
Perfect. And speaking of sources, Robin is asking if it would be possible to get a list of your sources, particularly would love to see the Knox and King letters. Is that all available in your blog? If they were to look up Eliza Hamilton Surprise on your blog, that they would have the citations that they could then click through and connect to their locations?
Yeah, so two ways people can find it, and I want to be transparent and share. I love sharing it, and I'm glad people are asking. So you can Google, in quotes, Eliza Philadelphia Surprise, and that will bring you up to the 3 posts that I did dealing with this discovery and these letters. Another way to do it is just go to Statutes and Stories and go to the index, and you'll be able to find it by going through the index. And then the Fanny Antill, I like to give names to things, so I call it Little Orphan Fanny. So if you put in quotes Little Orphan Fanny and you Google it, it'll probably bring you to I think I did 3 posts or 2 posts talking about these materials, showing the Hamilton Antill connection, and then how the Antill connection to the Morris family. So again, you can go to Statutes and Stories in the index, or Google, in quotes, Little Orphan Fanny, or in quotes, Eliza, Eliza, Eliza Philadelphia Surprise. And thank you, Michael, for correcting me that Eliza was not at Yorktown, but she was at other encampments during the war. And that's why you need scholars on these calls.
Thank you, Adam. We have a question here. Curious to learn what led you to the shipping correspondence. Mariana comments, it's such a great find. How did you first dive into that?
Yeah, so thank you. That's an excellent question. So a lot of this archival research is sometimes you get lucky and you see something and you start asking questions. And when I was actually researching another idea that I had, I was going through the Rufus King papers and this was the letter from Knox to Rufus King, and that's the one where I described that I fell out of my chair when I saw it said, Mrs. Hamilton will be part of our party, will be of our party. And that's when I shot off an email to Professor Kaminsky. I sent an email off to Brookhiser, and a few others. And I said, is this possible? Could this be Eliza? And long story short, we connected the dots, and I think it's definitive. If we were arguing a case to a jury, the different requirements of proof, I think it's beyond a reasonable doubt. She was absolutely in Philadelphia when you take the Shippen letter and you can connect it with these other sources. Well, I wish we knew more, but I think we have enough to definitively say she was there on the 18th. So how did I find the Shippen letter? I was looking for something else. And that's another point for researchers. researchers, have an open mind. When you see something, when you're reading through correspondence, even if others have looked at it, and if they only give a partial excerpt, if you're able to read it in its entirety and read it with a skeptical eye, what could this mean? And that's why, and I keep referring to Professor Kaminsky, but he did a 50-year career and is still doing a 50-plus-year career going through the archival collections, putting together of the ratification of the Constitution. This is the documentary history of the ratification of the Constitution. And I know he's in the process of adding yet another record recently discovered. So there's a lot that's being added. And, the work of archivists and the work of documentary historians that assemble the historic record, it's an invaluable work, and we need more of it.
Thank you, Adam. Michael actually has a question here. Was this Shippen that you mentioned the father of Peggy, wife of Benedict Arnold? And Robin added in that her father was Edward Shippen, but the Shippen family were quite influential in Philadelphia. Could you add to that as well?
Yeah, so I don't know all of the dynamics of the Shippen family, but suffice it to say that there were all kinds of connections, and I don't know offhand if it was Benedict Arnold, but it's a very prominent family, and they were having these parties, and as you heard, that the Shippen mother was a member of the Lee dynasty, and it's easy enough to figure out because there are no secrets about who the Shippens were, but they were one of the I don't want to call them aristocratic, but one of the very powerful, very well-connected families. And that also makes the point about their son, who's in England. He's doing the tour of Europe, the Grand Tour. If you read some of these other letters, you see they're trying to figure out who they want him to marry and other family connections. So, by all means, there's a lot going on with these the social scene in Philadelphia. And if I had more time, I would get. I apologize, I don't know the answers exactly how all the Shippens relate to one another, but the father and the son are the letters that we're talking about today between Dr. Shippen and his son, who's in London. And the sister
Perfect.
is the one who's hosting the party, if you will.
Okay, great. And thank you to Robin for clarifying for us in the chat as well. We have a very interesting theory here from Paul Levinson of why Eliza might have come to Philadelphia. Perhaps Hamilton missed Eliza's cooking and wanted her to cook certain meals for him.
So leave it to my uncle, who doesn't like to be late for dinner. And my uncle did some of the work, by the way, at the New York Historical Society. So these are all good questions. Now, another issue which Paul is indirectly raising is, where was Eliza staying? And that's one of the reasons I've been looking at a lot of this is this deals with Tim and some of the colleagues in the AHA Society in our Philadelphia project and Mrs. Daly, because we know that Alexander stayed with Mrs. Daly I should say Miss Daly, because she was not married. So we know that Gouverneur Morris was living with Miss Daly, and we know that Alexander was living with Miss Daly in the August timeframe. We don't know where Alexander was in June, and it's possible if Alexander was this all gets into speculation, but when Eliza came to town, they haven't seen each other presumably for several weeks, so they're going to want some privacy, and some boarding houses had more privacy than another. So it's possible that he may have wanted to move to other locations, from one boarding house to another. City Tavern, I don't think, had much privacy, whereas Miss Daly, I think, did have more privacy. So there are all kinds of reasons why there's a lot we still don't know. And I think there are all kinds of good reasons why Eliza came. And I welcome additional thoughts on why.
Fantastic. Well, and Adam, we would love to hear what you're able to share with us, of course, what currently your focus is, or any interesting research that you're diving into at the moment that maybe ties into this or expands. Of course, we don't want to spoil too much. We look forward to having you back, hopefully in September, for Constitution Day to dive into some more of the Constitution research. But I would just love to hear what you have on your horizon.
I appreciate that. So there's a book that will hopefully, in the academic publishing process is slow, but hopefully in 2026, we're going to have the book. The name of the book will be America's Founding Hosts. And this really gives some insights for everybody into some of the work behind the scenes, which is what I refer to as a forensic audit of the Constitutional Convention. In other words, track the receipts. What can we figure out about where the delegates were staying? And this, by the way, is in a way social history, right? And the alignment of The Virginians usually stayed with Mrs. House, who was from a Virginian. The Massachusetts delegates, for example, were staying with Miss Daly. And we can get into some fascinating conversations about what Professor Kaminsky, if I were to paraphrase him, about how birds of a feather flock together, that some of the delegates from Massachusetts who thought similar with regard to slavery, who are anti-slavery, it's not a surprise that they were staying with Miss Daly in a boarding house owned by a member of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. So there's all kinds of, I think, inferences we can draw about where they were staying and who they were staying with, and alignment of these delegations from different states. So hopefully everybody will get that book when it's finalized by the publisher, and that deals with this connection between these boarding house operators. And remember, Philadelphia is the largest city. New York is one of the largest cities. And as it turns out, Miss Daly, who operates her boarding house in Philadelphia, her two brothers-in-law and her sisters operate New York boarding houses. This is in Fraunces Tavern and also Simmons Tavern in New York. And then her brother Gifford Daly operates during the war. This is the City Tavern. He operates for a period of time. So this family is in a way it's almost a franchise business, that you would go from one boarding house in New York to another boarding house in Philadelphia, and it's the same family. Think of almost the Hilton chain in New York and Philadelphia. So that's what the book is going to be talking about, and I call it the first family of hospitality. And Hamilton would have known both Eliza and Alexander, the members of this family, the Daly, Francis, Simmons family.
Amazing. Well, we'll definitely have to have you back for a book talk when that comes out for our virtual book club. Sounds incredible. Thank you again, Adam. This has been such a really fascinating presentation. It's rare that you get to hear a presentation about new discoveries. And in the chat, much gratitude for your careful and exhaustive research on the topic. So we are just so pleased and so thankful to be in partnership with you and see all these new discoveries that you're making. And again, on behalf of the AHA Society, I do hope that you all will continue to connect with us. We look forward to seeing you at a future event. Please stay in touch with us. Please visit the ahasociety.org. We would appreciate if you would donate a Hamilton, $10 or so, to support tonight's programming and our future programming to continue to make this available for free to the public as much as possible. With that, I thank you, Adam, and wish you all a great evening. Take care, everyone.